The town of Greenville, Ohio, nestled between wide fields and winding roads, held tightly to its traditions. It was the kind of place where neighbors still waved from porches, where the air on Sunday mornings carried the sound of church bells, and where the pews of Central Baptist Church filled with familiar faces long before the opening hymn. Central Baptist has stood for nearly a century at the corner of Maple and Third, its white wooden frame weathered by time, but lovingly preserved by its congregation. Every Sunday, the same people sat in the same places. The Harrisons occupied the second row on the left. Mrs. Lanning, who never missed a service, preferred the seat closest to the aisle, so she could slip out early and get the pot roast started. And, without question, the front center pew belonged, by silent consensus, to Jake Thompson. Jake was 27 tall and self-assured in a way that sometimes teetered into arrogance. Raised in Greenville, he'd once been the golden boy, star quarterback in high school, local business owner by 25, and now a vocal, confident presence at church. He didn't speak from the pulpit, but he made himself heard, quick with a joke, quicker with a sarcastic aside, always surrounded by a rotating group of young friends who treated Sunday service more like a weekly social. Jake's pew was a symbol of that presence. No one had assigned it to him. No brass plaque marked it as his. But for the past 5 years, he'd arrived, often late, and slid confidently into that front row seat, nodding to those around him as if greeting an audience. On one quiet Sunday in late September, as the trees outside began to show the first hints of autumn, something shifted. The church doors opened earlier than usual. It was barely past 8, and most of the congregation would not arrive for at least another half hour. But there she was, Eleanor Carter. Eleanor had lived in Greenville longer than most of its buildings. At 82 years old, she moved slowly but with purpose. Her white hair was pulled back neatly beneath a powder blue hat that had seen decades of service. She wore a faded gray dress and walked with a cane that tapped softly against the wooden floor as she entered. Most Sundays, Eleanor sat near the back. It was easier for her to slip in and out unnoticed, especially since she'd stopped driving. Her late husband, Harold, had passed away 6 years earlier, and her children lived out of state. She'd become something of a quiet presence, always there, always kind, rarely in the spotlight. But this Sunday, she took a different path. Instead of making her way to the rear pews, Eleanor walked steadily down the center aisle. A few early-arriving congregants noticed, whispering softly to each other. Some raised their eyebrows as she passed. No one stopped her, though a few exchanged knowing glances. When Eleanor reached the front pew, the one that Jake and his friends had claimed years ago, she paused. With a gentle sigh, she lowered herself into the center of the bench, placing her small purse neatly on her lap. Her hands, slightly gnarled from arthritis, folded over it. Then she simply sat, gazing toward the altar in quiet reflection. By the time the rest of the congregation began to arrive, the tension had already begun to simmer. Is she really sitting there? One young woman whispered to her husband as they walked in. "That's Jake's seat," someone muttered behind them. Still, no one approached her. Eleanor greeted those who walked by with a warm smile, nodding softly to the children who recognized her from Sunday school years ago. Her eyes, faded but alert, didn't wander. She remained still calm as the church slowly filled. Jake, true to form, arrived 10 minutes before the service began, flanked by 2 of his usual companions, Tyler and Mason. They entered through the side door with the easy confidence of men who assumed the room would wait for them. Jake wore a dark blue blazer over a white shirt, no tie, and his signature grin that walked the line between charm and mockery. As he stepped into the sanctuary, he stopped short. There she was, Eleanor Carter, in his seat. For a second, he simply stared. His friends noticed too, elbowing each other with barely suppressed snickers. Jake tilted his head, as if trying to understand what he was seeing. Then, loud enough for the nearest dozen people to hear, he said with a smirk, "Well, would you look at that? Looks like someone forgot this isn't her living room. Hope she brought the cat and the remote." Laughter erupted from the few who stood closest. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't truly joyful, more nervous, more performative, the kind that echoed too sharply in a place meant for reverence. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't even turn to look at him. Instead, she smiled softly, almost to herself, and continued looking forward as if Jake had never spoken. The room, once filled with a low hum of pre-service chatter, grew quiet. Conversations faded. A few people glanced toward the pulpit, perhaps wondering if the pastor would say something. He didn't. Reverend Carter, no relation, stood near the organ, his expression unreadable. Jake's smile faltered for just a second. He motioned toward the second row and sat down behind Eleanor, shaking his head as if to say, "Can you believe this?" Tyler and Mason sat beside him, still chuckling. The service began shortly thereafter, but the atmosphere had shifted. The hymns sounded flatter. The prayers felt stiffer. Eleanor remained quietly attentive throughout, mouthing the words to every song, nodding gently during the sermon, her hands still folded in her lap. Jake, meanwhile, whispered intermittently to his friends, making occasional quips under his breath. A few nearby congregants cast glances in his direction, but said nothing. As the final hymn played and the organ swelled, Reverend Carter stepped forward, ready to deliver the benediction. But before he could speak, Eleanor rose from her seat. It took effort. She pressed one hand to the edge of the pew and the other to her cane, and slowly, carefully, stood. "I'd like to say something," she said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It had the weight of age and the clarity of purpose. The room stilled. The pastor hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside and nodding. Eleanor began to walk toward the pulpit. Each step was deliberate, her cane tapping steadily against the floor. Jake leaned back, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. No one knew what she would say. Most assumed it would be brief, a few words of thanks, perhaps a memory or a prayer request. But when Eleanor reached the microphone and placed her hands on either side of it, she lifted her head and began to speak, and everything changed. The church was so still that even the faint creak of the pulpit under Eleanor's hands seemed to echo. No one shifted in their seat, no coughs, no whispers, just a quiet anticipation that only comes when a room full of people knows they are about to hear something important, whether they are ready for it or not. Eleanor didn't rush. She stood with the same calm that had brought her to the front pew. She adjusted the microphone slightly downward, closer to her level, and let out a breath that trembled only slightly before her voice came, steady and unforced. "I won't take long," she said, her eyes slowly moving across the rows of faces. "I just wanted to say a few things, and then I'll take my seat." There was no introduction, no apology for speaking, no hesitation. It wasn't defiant, but it wasn't timid either. Jake, sitting directly behind where she'd been all service, leaned forward, arms resting on the back of the pew in front of him. His smirk was gone. If he had a thought ready to toss like a pebble into the silence, he kept it to himself this time. Eleanor began with a story. Not a sermon, not a lecture, just a moment of memory, spoken plainly. She told him about the first time she walked through the doors of Central Baptist, in the spring of 1954. She was newly married then. Her husband, Harold, had just taken a job at the post office, and they were looking for a place to feel grounded. This church, she said, was the first place that felt like home. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "It was here I found my footing. It was here we raised our children. We buried our son in this sanctuary. And my husband, too, right there where the sunlight hits the floor." There was no sentimentality in her tone, but the weight of what she said pressed quietly into the chest of everyone listening. She spoke of how time had made her invisible, not out of cruelty, but out of simple neglect. How people stopped making eye contact as the years passed. How, in the past year, no one had sat with her. No one had asked if she needed a ride. "And I never held that against anyone," she said. "We all live busy lives. I know that. But I think we forget, sometimes, how much it means to be seen." A shift rippled through the congregation then, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Shoulders lowered. Eyes dropped. A few people looked at each other, uncertain of what they were feeling, but aware that something had cracked open. "I sat up front today," Eleanor continued, "because my hearing is failing. I wanted to make sure I caught every word. I've been walking 30 minutes from my house each Sunday, and I worry there won't be too many more of those walks left in me. But I didn't come to make anyone uncomfortable. I didn't come to take anyone's seat. I came because I needed to hear the word. The weight of those last words settled heavily over the room. The same people who had chuckled minutes earlier now sat utterly still. The laughter, which had bounced so easily off the walls, now hung somewhere above their heads like smoke that refused to clear. Eleanor turned slightly to face the congregation more directly. I know I'm old. I know I move slow. I know my clothes are dated. And I don't talk like most of you do, but I've been through a lot. And when you've lived as long as I have, you learn to hold on tight to the things that keep you whole. For me, that's this place, these songs, this word, this peace. And I've needed that peace more than ever in these last few years. She paused. And for a moment, the only sound in the sanctuary was the low hum of the overhead lights and the ticking of the old clock above the organ. No one coughed. No one fidgeted. Even the children, usually restless by this point in the service, were quiet, drawn in by something they couldn't name. Some people find faith in their youth, Eleanor said. They hold on to it as they build families, careers, dreams. But some of us, we come to it through loss, through silence, through days when getting out of bed feels like too much. And on those days, faith isn't just something you believe. It's something you cling to. Her eyes found the pastor then, who stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, tears held back behind his glasses. Reverend Carter, she said gently, thank you for letting me speak. I won't take more time. She stepped back, her hands briefly gripping the edges of the pulpit for balance, and began her slow return down the aisle. The same cane, the same pace. But the atmosphere around her was transformed. People leaned aside instinctively, creating space for her not just physically, but emotionally. Jake remained still. His hands had slipped from the back of the pew, now resting in his lap, fingers interlaced. His eyes followed her, not in mockery, but in something far less certain. He looked unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with an unfamiliar tug at his conscience. No one applauded. It wasn't the moment for that. There was only silence, the thick, meaningful kind that follows words you cannot unhear. Eleanor sat back in the same front row pew. The organist, clearly unsure whether to proceed, glanced toward the pastor, who gave a quiet nod. The closing hymn began, softer than usual, and those who joined in did so with voices more subdued, more reflective. After the service, the usual murmuring of conversation didn't resume immediately. People lingered in their seats, talking in whispers or not at all. The kids didn't rush to the courtyard, and the laughter that typically returned by the time the congregation reached the lobby never came. Jake remained where he was long after others had started filing out. Tyler nudged him once, but he didn't move. He sat with his head slightly bowed, staring at the polished wood of the pew in front of him. When he finally stood, it was without his usual ease. He didn't wait for his friends. He walked out alone. Outside, the sun was warm, but it didn't lift the heaviness that had settled over those who'd been inside. Groups formed on the lawn, not for idle chat, but in quiet reflection. Some looked toward Eleanor, who sat on the church steps, adjusting her hat against the breeze. A few people approached her, gently, respectfully, but she didn't seem to expect their company. She just sat there, quietly, watching the people she had known for decades rediscover her in the span of 10 minutes. Inside the sanctuary, Reverend Carter remained at the pulpit long after most had gone, staring at the spot where Eleanor had stood. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the church had not just witnessed a testimony, it had experienced a reckoning. The next morning, the usual rhythm of Greenville resumed. Coffee brewed in quiet kitchens, dogs barked in fenced yards, and morning papers landed with soft thuds on porches. But for those who had sat inside Central Baptist the day before, something about the air felt different. The memory of Eleanor Carter's voice lingered not just in ears, but in minds, carving out a discomfort that many weren't prepared to admit aloud. Some avoided talking about it altogether, pretending it had been just another service. Others found themselves thinking back to her words during the most mundane of routines, folding laundry, walking to the mailbox, or stirring soup over the stove. Jake Thompson, for once, didn't show up at the Java stop, the coffee shop where he usually spent his Monday mornings laughing with friends and checking emails. He stayed home, alone, seated at his kitchen table with his laptop open but untouched. The sunlight spilled across the surface, highlighting the stillness of a room. He replayed the moment over and over, his comment, the laughter, the silence that followed, and then her voice, calm and piercing in its honesty. He couldn't explain why it had shaken him. It wasn't the words, exactly, but the way she had looked out at everyone, as if holding a mirror up to their hearts. For 2 days, he avoided church matters. He ignored text messages from Tyler and Mason, skipped a planning meeting for the upcoming youth fundraiser, and spent more time than usual driving aimlessly through the countryside. On Wednesday afternoon, he passed by Eleanor's house. He knew it from childhood, the pale yellow one with the green shutters just off Birch Street. He slowed his car, uncertain what he thought he was doing, but didn't stop. He saw the porch swing gently moving in the breeze, though no one sat in it. By the following Sunday, Eleanor's testimony had become more than a personal confession, without her intending it. It had turned into something communal, a reckoning that reshaped quiet conversations among congregants who were used to comfort over confrontation. Before service began, the church foyer was filled with hushed murmurs. There were no jokes from Jake, no booming laughter from his group. In fact, he wasn't there. Reverend Carter, sensing the change, opened the service with a prayer that felt more like an acknowledgement of guilt than a liturgical formality. His voice, usually warm and steady, was softer than usual, his pauses more reflective. "May we remember," he said at the end of the invocation, "that faith without humility is hollow." Eleanor, for her part, returned to her usual seat in the back that morning, as if nothing had changed. She greeted the few who approached her with the same gentle smile, declining each offer to sit closer to the front. She listened, as she always did, to the hymns and the sermon, but her presence carried new weight, one that everyone else now recognized, even if she never claimed it for herself. It was after the service that something truly shifted. A teenager named Lucy, who usually left quickly with her parents, stayed behind. She approached Eleanor timidly, clutching a notebook against her chest. "Mrs. Carter," she said, barely above a whisper, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Eleanor turned, her expression open. "Of course, dear." Lucy sat beside her. The girl looked down, fingers fidgeting with the corners of her notebook. "I've been coming here since I was little," she began, "but I don't think I ever really listened before. Last week, what you said, it made me feel like I was supposed to be here. Like maybe I wasn't invisible either." Eleanor took a slow breath and placed a hand gently over Lucy's. "You're not invisible. You're just beginning to see yourself." Others noticed the exchange. By the following week, more young people approached her after service, not with fanfare or public declarations, but with quiet questions, personal stories, and a hunger for something more real than what the church routine had offered them. Eleanor didn't preach. She never stood at the pulpit again, but she listened, asked questions, and occasionally offered small pieces of her experience in return. In a matter of days, she had become the spiritual center of the congregation without ever asking to be. Jake, still absent from service, felt this shift through the grapevine. His mother, an elder in the church, mentioned it one evening over dinner, her tone pointed but not cruel. "You might want to come next week," she said, spooning potatoes onto her plate. "Something's different. People are paying attention again." He didn't respond at first. He pushed food around on his plate, his appetite dulled by a gnawing guilt that had only grown in silence. That Saturday, just before dusk, Jake parked in front of Eleanor's house. He sat behind the wheel for nearly 10 minutes before stepping out. His knock on her door was light, almost unsure. When it opened, Eleanor stood there in a simple cardigan and a long skirt, her eyes kind but surprised. "Jake," she said, no trace of sarcasm or reproach in her voice. "Well, this is unexpected." "I know," he said, hands in his jacket pockets. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me." He hesitated. I don't know why I said what I said last week. I thought I was being funny. I always do that, and no one ever calls me on it." Eleanor didn't reply right away. She stepped back and gestured toward a small bench on her porch. "Sit with me a minute?" He nodded, and they sat side by side, the late summer air cool against her skin. "I wasn't angry," she said after a moment, "but I was tired of feeling like a shadow in a place I used to feel alive in." "I didn't know that," he said. "You weren't supposed to. But sometimes, Jake, knowing isn't the most important part. Noticing is." He let the words settle. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Well, that's a good part. You get to figure that out. Starting with showing up." The sun dipped below the tree lean, and they sat quietly, 2 generations sharing the kind of silence that said more than any sermon. And though Jake didn't know it yet, that conversation would be the beginning of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Humility not as shame, but as a chance to become someone worth listening to. By the following Sunday, the congregation of Central Baptist Church moved with a quiet attentiveness that hadn't been present in years. There were no whispered jokes before the service, no sounds of rushed footsteps echoing through the wooden aisles as members arrived last minute. Instead, people sat earlier, softer, as if anticipating something more than a sermon, as if listening had finally become more than a formality. Jake Thompson arrived 15 minutes early, alone. He didn't make an entrance. He walked through the front doors, nodded politely to a few familiar faces, and took a seat on the far left, midway through the sanctuary. He didn't glance toward the front pew, though he noticed out of the corner of his eye that it remained empty, not because of avoidance or awkwardness, but out of reverence. After Eleanor's testimony and the subtle transformation it stirred, no one dared reclaim that spot as their own. What followed that morning was a service stripped of pretense. Reverend Carter, who normally opened with a prepared statement and warm pleasantries, simply walked to the pulpit and paused. He looked out over his congregation, many of whom now sat with straighter backs and open eyes, and said only, "Let's begin today in gratitude." Quiet, honest gratitude. And so the hymns were sung not louder, but with a kind of fragile unity. The prayers were spoken with more pauses, longer silences between phrases, as if each person was finding the words for the first time. Jake remained still throughout, hands clasped, eyes downward, not in shame, but in thought. Something had shifted in him, a slowing of the ego, a quieting of the reflex to dominate a room. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. After the service, a moment unfolded that no one planned. As the final notes of the piano drifted into silence, a young mother named Karen stood and turned to face the rows behind her. She cleared her throat gently and said, "I just want to thank Mrs. Carter for last week. I've been thinking about what she said, and I just want to say I'm sorry I never really saw her before." A murmur swept the sanctuary, not of discomfort, but of agreement. Then another voice, from an older man in the back, Mr. Green, a deacon who had attended for over 50 years, spoke with quiet conviction. She reminded us what this church was built for. We've forgotten. People began nodding, not as a performance, but as if giving permission to one another to feel the same thing. It wasn't emotional catharsis. It was communal awakening. And in the absence of Eleanor's voice that day, she hadn't come, choosing to rest at home. Her words lingered with greater strength than ever. Throughout the week, the impact deepened. Mrs. Henderson, who had long coordinated the church's community outreach but had grown weary over the years, proposed a new initiative: Sunday visits to homebound members. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was purposeful. "We spent too long thinking of church as what happens here," she said during a Tuesday meeting, "and not who we're meant to show up for." Jake volunteered first. He didn't offer a speech or explanation. He simply raised his hand when names were called. When he was assigned Eleanor's name on the list, there was a brief pause in the room, but no objections. The gesture wasn't questioned, and he didn't try to defend it. That Thursday, he visited her again. This time, she had set out 2 glasses of sweet tea on her front porch table, as if expecting him. They didn't talk much about church. Instead, Eleanor told him about her late husband's obsession with radio repair, how he used a tinker for hours in the garage even after his hearing had begun to fail. Jake listened closely, responding not with jokes or attempts to relate, but with attention. He asked questions that didn't serve himself. He didn't try to impress her. When she spoke, He gave her the dignity of silence. She noticed, before he left, Eleanor said something that lingered in his chest well into the night. "You know, Jake," she said as he stepped off her porch, "you're not a bad man. You just never had to sit still long enough to hear yourself think." He nodded, hands in his pockets, and walked slowly back to his car. Word of Jake's visit spread, but not through gossip, through change. People noticed he had stopped dominating the conversations in group meetings. He no longer sat with his usual crowd on Sundays. He came earlier, stayed longer, listened more. When he did speak, it was softer, more reflective, and slowly others followed. The cliques that once defined the church's social structure began to dissolve. Older members sat next to younger ones. The foyer, once segmented by age and familiarity, became a place of genuine interaction. The pastor remarked on it one evening during a small group. "It's not revival in the usual sense," he said, "but it feels like we're being rebuilt from the inside." What no one admitted aloud, but everyone knew, was that it had all begun with a single moment of humiliation that gave birth to humility. Jake's fall from his self-made pedestal had not shattered him. It had, instead, made space for something more solid to grow. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained as consistent as ever. She did not bask in the attention. She didn't accept invitations to speak again. She simply returned to her seat in the back each Sunday, nodded at those who passed, and sometimes offered a brief word to those who lingered. Her presence became a grounding force, not because of any official role, but because she had become the conscience of the congregation. Quiet, unwavering, and deeply human. One evening, as September faded into October, a group of teenagers gathered outside the church after choir rehearsal. They sat on the steps, passing around stories and homework frustrations, when one of them, Lucas, the pastor's youngest son, pointed toward the front doors and said, "We should do something for Mrs. Carter, like a thank you." They agreed without hesitation. No one joked, no one rolled their eyes. They weren't doing it for praise. They were doing it because somehow she had given them all permission to be more than what they had been. And so plans quietly began to take shape, not for a grand celebration, but for something sincere, a service of appreciation, an evening of testimonies, not about Eleanor, but about what she had helped them remember about themselves. In the hush of those late summer weeks, Central Baptist didn't become perfect. It didn't suddenly erase the patterns of years past, but it became unmistakably more honest. And at the center of that change, without ever claiming credit or demanding notice, was an old woman with fading hearing and a heart that saw clearer than most. The first real cold snap came quietly. Greenville's mornings were suddenly shrouded in fog, and a thin crust of frost began to form on windshields before dawn. The leaves, which had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson only weeks before, now clung to the branches in weary clusters or swirled along sidewalks in brittle piles. In that quiet shift of season, Eleanor Carter's absence was first noticed not by words, but by the stillness of the pew. She didn't come to church that Sunday, nor the one after. At first, people assumed she was simply resting, or perhaps visiting family, though those closest to her knew she rarely left town anymore. On the third Sunday, her neighbor, Ruth Manning, a retired nurse who occasionally helped Eleanor with errands, approached Reverend Carter before the service began. Her voice was low, her expression unreadable. "She passed," Ruth said, peacefully, in her sleep, Thursday morning. The pastor nodded, absorbing the words with a tightness in his chest that no sermon could soothe. He didn't announce it immediately, not during the service, not in the bulletin. He waited until the final hymn had ended and the sanctuary stood in soft, reflective silence, and then stepped to the pulpit, removing his glasses slowly as if preparing the room for the weight of what he was about to say. "This morning, I received news that one of our own has gone home," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Eleanor Carter passed away in her sleep this week. And while she would never have wanted a fuss made about her, I believe we owe her more than silence." There was no gasp, no outcry, just a heavy stillness, as if the walls themselves were mourning. The week that followed became a series of quiet tributes, not dramatic displays or grand processions, but gestures steeped in humility, the kind Eleanor herself might have approved of. Flowers were left at her porch step by children who remembered her from Sunday school stories. Cards filled with memories and apologies appeared in the church office. One note and sign, read only, "You changed me. Thank you." On the next Sunday, the sanctuary was fuller than it had been in years. Not for a holiday, not for a guest preacher, but for a service held in her memory. There was no casket, no procession. Eleanor had requested no funeral, no formal ceremony, only that people remember her with kindness, not spectacle. But the congregation felt a pull to gather, to say what had gone unsaid for too long. Jake was the first to arrive. He sat in the very pew Eleanor had claimed weeks before, not because it had become a symbol, but because it had become a promise, a reminder of who they were meant to see, who they had once overlooked. He hadn't spoken publicly since her passing, but that morning, as the pastor opened the floor for reflections, Jake stood. The room fell silent, not in anticipation of mockery or showmanship, but in genuine openness. Jake didn't carry notes. He didn't clear his throat theatrically. He simply stepped forward, placed one hand on the edge of the pulpit, and began. "I didn't know Eleanor," he said. "Not really. I saw her every week. Walked past her. Sometimes laughed at her. But I didn't know her until she let us see her, until she told us the truth." He paused, the silence behind him full and attentive. "I was so sure of myself," he continued, "so comfortable in my place, in the sound of my own voice, that I forgot what it meant to actually hear someone. She didn't scold me. She didn't shame me. She just told the truth. And it humbled me in a way I didn't know I needed." He looked out across the room, not to impress, but to connect. "She reminded me that this place, this church, isn't about who sits where or who gets to speak the loudest. It's about presence, faith, grace." She brought us back to that. When he stepped down, there was no applause, only the kind of reverent silence that had become sacred in the wake of Eleanor's words. Others followed. A teacher spoke of how Eleanor had shown up with cookies during a particularly hard school year, never saying much but always knowing when comfort was needed. A widow shared how Eleanor's handwritten notes, always signed with just E, had kept her from falling into despair after her husband died. One of the teenagers, Lucy, stood last, her voice trembling but resolute. "She saw me," Lucy said simply. "That's all. No one else really did. But she did, and that made all the difference." By the end of the service, it was clear that Eleanor's memory wouldn't fade. Her legacy wasn't in grand actions or sweeping gestures. It was in a quiet revolution of attention, in the way she turned the congregation back toward one another. The final tribute came not in the form of speech or song, but in something so simple and pure that it didn't need explanation. A small plaque, fastened at the end of the front pew, bore a short inscription, reserved for those who need to hear with their hearts. It wasn't announced. No ceremony accompanied it. But on the following Sundays, that seat was never empty. Sometimes it held a newcomer, sometimes a grieving widow, sometimes a restless teenager, but always someone who, in their own way, needed to be heard, even in silence. As the weeks passed, the church changed, not outwardly, not in structure or decor, but in atmosphere. The casual sarcasm that once laced social gatherings faded. The age divisions that once segmented the community began to blur. Small groups expanded to include voices that had once gone ignored. Even the youth group, long detached from the older members, began attending intergenerational Bible studies, drawn not by obligation, but by curiosity, by the need to understand how someone like Eleanor had carried such quiet strength. Jake, for his part, never returned to his old role. He didn't lead ministries or organize events. Instead, he showed up early, quietly, with intention. He visited shut-ins. He walked people to their cars in the rain. He helped without needing to be noticed. And he kept visiting Eleanor's porch, even after her passing. Once a month, without fail, he would sit on the bench she had invited him to, sometimes with a book, sometimes with nothing at all, just letting the wind speak where words were no longer needed. Central Baptist never fully articulated what had changed. There was no rebranding, no formal declaration of a new mission. But those who walked through its doors would feel it. that the church had been cracked open not by doctrine or policy, but by the unflinching honesty of a woman who chose kindness over retaliation, who reminded them all that being seen, truly seen, could be the holiest gift of all,